Good morning, good morning, good morning, and welcome back to Storytime Saturdays. I will be your narrator again, Fraggeth. And today we continue with some more of Peter Watts's Blindsight. Um, now, tied into this, I've started reading a book by Julian James. The title is The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. And that ties in very neatly with some of the themes and ideas explored in Peter Watts's Blindsight. In fact, I think he winds up mentioning that book in the afterword, which is basically him collecting together. Here are I, as the author's thought processes on how the stuff in this book works. Here where these ideas came from. Here are some of their bases in reality. Here are their here's how things are totally fictional, and a few other things. And it just like he's got by the end of it, what, like almost 100 citations and references, in excess of 100. How many does he have total? Like 130, including one or two jokes that are there. Uh, he probably saw that he was at 129 and then was like, I can't leave it at that number. Made it 130 because that's nice and round. Um, I should really read through these carefully and see if he does mention the book by name. But someone I know had been talking about, oh yeah, rereading. Been meaning to reread Julian James's The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, which is kind of about, it's kind of it's a text on someone trying to theorize, okay, when did we become, as human beings, self-aware? Uh, when did that occur? What's the origin of consciousness as we know it? How has that changed over the years? What what advantages does consciousness confer? Uh, and it's pretty heady. It's very, it's very textbooky. There's a lot going on there. It's fairly dry material for the most part, but it's very some very cool stuff in there. Um, but I'm reading through that at their recommendation, and hopefully they will be reading through Blindsight at my recommendation, because I'm like, hey, that sounds like a lot of overlap with this book I'm reading, um, rereading technically. I've also found a couple neat little images for Blindsight. Some artist has made them. They were like a 3D um, CGI images. Let's see where I hid those. I do not know the artist's name, unfortunately. But all credit goes to them, not to me. Uh, where are you? Here we go. Book covers. I think I hid it under. There we go. Okay. Now I just have to get these on there. Come on. Here we go. Unfortunately, this interface I'm using is not what I would call ideal. Properties, browse. Here we go. That'll help. I just have to not go whizzing past. Where did we leave off? All right, I'll start off with this one, and I'll try and adjust sizing on the fly. What is that gonna do? It's gonna do that. Okay. I'll get it centered in a sec. I have OCD when it comes to that. Here we go. And center that. So this is a cool scene of presumably from Siri Keaton's perspective, I think, um, with Amanda James on the left, uh, Amanda Bates rather on the left, Sarasti in the middle, and presumably uh, Susan James on the right. I don't think it's Spindle. I don't know if I have any images of Spindle. Um, there are reasons for that. Another one I have here. Let me get that in here, and it's going to do all sorts of fun sizing shenanigans. Is an image of Rorschach, which I think is super cool. And I'm going to have to shrink that puppy down considerably. Oops, nope, nope, don't do that. So there is clearly a fine art here for, come on, stick to the middle. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay. Don't expand beyond the border. And my OCD is not going to let me let that hang there, so I'm going to beep, 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 boop, boop, boop. There we go. Pretty cool one of Rorschach. Let me make sure that's actually coming through on the stream. It occurs to me that I have no idea. Where are you? Options. There's an easier way to check this. I'm just gonna hope that that's coming through on the stream. Here we go. As you can see, despite having done this for several months, I'm kind of new to the concept of actually doing these on the fly. Yes, it's showing. We good. We good. Nice. Okay. So I'll leave that up there for now. So that's Rorschach. And I think that's a really good interpretation of Rorschach given the information that we have about how it's intended to look or supposed to look. I'm going to take a quick drink here. So immediately previously, they had made their first foray into Rorschach. Um, and while they were there, they had experiences. By experiences, I mean people did weird stuff, people felt weird things, and weird things generally were occurring, um, such as Amanda Bates knowing for certain that she was dead. Um, and one of Susan James's personalities, Cruncher, I believe, trying very hard to rip off his own leg. Sarasti, of course, is not with them for obvious reasons. Captain doesn't go in with the grunts in a potentially lethal environment. That's not how it works. There are other reasons why he's not with them that are not as obvious, but will become clear in time. Let's see. We also, immediately before we ended last week, we learned something about Amanda Bates's background as a soldier and some of the things she did in terms of out of the box solutions to resolve a conflict, which are largely the reason she's there. Partly because the military wants a representative, partly because she does come up with out of the box solutions, but probably mostly because she is persona non grata with the military, and they figure, hey, she's out of the way for a while, and more importantly, this mission has like a 0% chance of succeeding as far as they're concerned. She's probably going to die. Dollars to donuts, everybody's going to die out there anyway, so then she'll be out of their hair forever. At least that was some of the reasoning explored. But also that we, or Siri specifically, as we quote here, when the fate of the world hangs in the balance, you want to keep an eye on anyone whose career-defining moment involves consorting with the enemy. So, with that said, and it is a lot said. Um, let's see. I'm just gonna skip ahead here. I'm not gonna read ahead. Oh, I should have probably gone with one more chapter because that would have ended at a really dramatic point. So now we're gonna start with something really dramatic and then cool down a little bit and then get dramatic again. And I've got to be on the ball to switch an image around because it's gonna be desperately relevant later, and I've got one. Um, okay, because we've got some cool, and I think this is going to be from the same artist, but I'm not sure. I found these on the internet. I was perusing Blindsight images, and it because I was just looking for book covers, and I found to just have different changes of pace in terms of the background image that I'm showing. And these popped up, but I couldn't find the artist name. It wasn't through DeviantArt or anything. It was just, here's a collection of blind sight images. And I was like, these are super cool. So I snagged a couple. All right. What do we got? I get another drink of water here. Get some of the coffee mank out of my mouth. Yes, here on Storytime Saturdays, we tell you all the nasty details nobody really wants to hear. If you can see it, chances are it doesn't exist. Kate Kyo, grounds for suicide. 5 times we did it. Over 5 consecutive orbits, we threw ourselves between the monster's jaws, let it chew at us with a trillion microscopic teeth until Theseus reeled us in and stitched us back together. We crept through Rorschach's belly in fits and starts, focusing as best we could on the tasks at hand, trying to ignore the ghosts that tickled our midbrains. Sometimes the walls flexed subtly around us. Sometimes we only thought they did. Sometimes we took refuge in our diving bell while waves of charge and magnetism spiraled languidly past, like boluses of ectoplasm coursing down the intestine of some poltergeist god. Sometimes we got caught in the open. The gang would squabble among itself, uncertain which persona was which. Once I fell into a kind of walking paralysis while alien hands dragged me away down the hall. Fortunately, other hands brought me home, and voices that claimed to be real told me I'd made the whole thing up. Twice Amanda Bates found God, saw the fucker right there in front of her, knew beyond any shadow of a doubt that the Creator not only existed, but spoke to her, and her alone. Both times she lost her faith once we got her into the bell, but it was touch and go for a while. Her warrior drones, drunk on power but still under line of sight control, staggered from their perimeters and pointed their weapons along bearings too close for comfort. The grunts died fast. Some barely lasted a single foray, a few died in minutes. The longest lived were the slowest on the draw, half-blind, thick-witted, every command and response bottlenecked by raw, high-frequency sound buzzing across their shielded eardrums. Sometimes we backed them up with others that spoke optically, faster but nervous and even more vulnerable. Together they guarded against an opposition that had not yet shown its face. It hardly had to. Our troops fell even in the absence of enemy fire. We worked through it all, through fits and hallucinations and occasional convulsions. We tried to watch each other's backs while my magnetic tendrils tugged our inner ears and made us seasick. Sometimes we vomited into our helmets. Then we'd just hang on, white-faced, sucking sour air through clenched teeth, while the recyclers filtered chunks and blobs from our headspace. And we'd give silent thanks for the small mercy of non-stick, static repellent faceplates. It rapidly became obvious that my presence served as more than cannon fodder. It didn't matter that I lacked the gang's linguistic skills or Spindle's expertise in biology. I was another set of hands, in a place where anyone could be laid out at a moment's notice. The more people Sarasti kept in the field, the greater the odds that at least one of them would be halfway functional at any given moment. Even so, we were barely in any condition to accomplish anything. Every incursion was an exercise in reckless endangerment. We did it anyway. It was that or go home. The work proceeded in infinitesimal increments, hamstrung on every front. The gang wasn't finding any evidence of signage or speech to decipher, but the gross mechanics of this thing were easy enough to observe. Sometimes Rorschach partitioned itself, extruded ridges around its passageways like the cartilaginous hoops encircling a human trachea. Over hours, some of them might develop into contracting irises, into complete septa, lazy as warm candle wax. We seemed to be witnessing the growth of the structure in discrete segments. Rorschach grew mainly from the tips of its thorns. We'd made our incursion hundreds of meters from the nearest, but evidently the process extended at least this far back. If it was part of the normal growth process, though, it was a feeble echo of what must have been going on in the heart of the apical zones. We couldn't observe those directly, not from inside. Barely 100 meters toward the thorn, the tube grew too lethal even for suicidal flesh. But over those 5 orbits, Rorschach grew by another 8%, as mindless and mechanical as a growing crystal. Through it all, I tried to do my job. I compiled and collated, massaged data that I would never understand. I watched the systems around me as best I could, factored each tick and trait into the mix. One part of my mind produced synopses and syntheses, while another watched, incredulous and uncomprehending. Neither part could trace where those insights had come from. It was difficult, though. Sarasti wouldn't let me back outside the system. Every observation was contaminated by my own confounding presence in the mix. I did my best. I made no suggestions that might affect critical decisions. In the field, I did what I was told to, and no more. I tried to be like one of Bates's drones, a simple tool with no initiative and no influence on the group dynamic. I think I pulled it off, for the most part. My non-sights accumulated on schedule and piled up in Theseus's transmission stack, unsent. There was too much local interference to get a signal through to Earth. Spindle was right. The ghosts followed us back. We began to hear voices other than Serasti's, whispering up the spine. Sometimes even the brightly lit wraparound world of the drum would warp and jiggle from the corner of my eye, and more than once I saw bony, headless phantoms with too many arms nested in the scaffolding. They seemed solid enough from the corner of my eye, but any spot I focused on faded to shadow, to a dark, translucent stain against the background. They were so very fragile, these ghosts. The mere act of observation drilled holes through them. Spindle had rattled off dementias like raindrops. I went to consensus for enlightenment and found a whole other self buried below the limbic system, below the hindbrain, below even the cerebellum. It lived in the brain stem, and it was older than the vertebrates themselves. It was self-contained. It heard and saw and felt, independent of all those other parts layered on over top like evolutionary afterthoughts. It dwelt on nothing but its own survival. It had no time for planning or abstract analysis, spared effort only for the most rudimentary sensory processing. But it was fast, and it was dedicated, and it could react to threats in a fraction of the time it took smarter roommates to even become aware of them. And even when it couldn't, when the obstinate, unyielding neocortex refused to let it off the leash, it tried to pass on what it saw, and Isaac Spindle experienced an ineffable sense of where to reach. In a way, he had a stripped-down version of the gang in his head. Everyone did. I looked further and found God itself in the meat of the brain, found the static that had sent Bates into rapture and Michelle into convulsions. I tracked Gray syndrome to its headwaters in the temporal lobe. I heard voices ranting in the brains of schizophrenics. I found cortical infarcts that inspired people to reject their own limbs, imagined the magnetic fields that must have acted in their stead when Cruncher tried to dismember himself. And off in some half-forgotten pest hole of the 20th century case studies, filed under Cotard's syndrome, I found Amanda Bates and others of her kind, their brains torqued into denial of the very self. "I used to have a heart," one of them said listlessly from the archives. "Now I have something that beats in its place." Another demanded to be buried because his corpse was already stinking. There was more, a whole catalogue of finely tuned dysfunctions that Rorschach had not yet inflicted on us. Somnambulism, agnosias, hemi-neglect. Consensus served up a freak show to make any mind reel at its own fragility. A woman dying of thirst within easy reach of water, not because she couldn't see the faucet, but because she couldn't recognize it. A man for whom the left side of the universe did not exist, who could neither perceive nor conceive of the left side of his body, of a room, of a line of text. A man for whom the very concept of leftness had become literally unthinkable. Sometimes we could conceive of things and still not see them, although they stood right before us. Skyscrapers appeared out of thin air. The person talking to us changed into someone else during a momentary distraction, and we didn't notice. It wasn't magic. It was barely even misdirection. They called it inattentional blindness, and it had been well known for a century or more. A tendency for the eye to simply not notice things that evolutionary experience classed as unlikely. I found the opposite of Spindle's blindsight, a malady not in which the sighted believe they are blind, but one in which the blind insist they can see. The very idea was absurd unto insanity, and yet there they were. Retinas detached, optic nerves burned away, any possibility of vision denied by the laws of physics. Bumping into walls, tripping over furniture, inventing endless ludicrous explanations for their clumsiness. The lights unexpectedly turned off by some other party. A colorful bird glimpsed through the window, distracting attention from the obstacle ahead. I could see perfectly well, thank you. Nothing wrong with my eyes. Gauges in the head, Spindle had called them. But there were other things in there, too. There was a model of the world, and we didn't look outward at all. Our conscious selves saw only the simulation in our heads, an interpretation of reality, endlessly refreshed by input from the senses. What happens when those senses go dark, but the model, thrown off kilter by some trauma or tumor, fails to refresh? How long do we stare in at that obsolete rendering, recycling and massaging the same old data in a desperate subconscious act of utterly honest denial? How long before it dawns on us that the world we see no longer reflects the world we inhabit, that we are blind? Months, sometimes, according to the case files. For one poor woman, a year and more. Appeals to logic fail utterly. How could you see the bird when there is no window? How do you decide where your seen half world ends if you can't see the other half to weigh it against? If you are dead, how can you smell your own corruption? If you do not exist, Amanda, what is talking to us now? Useless. When you're in the grip of Cotard's syndrome or hemi-neglect, you cannot be swayed by argument. When you're in thrall to some alien artifact, you know that the self is gone, that reality ends at the midline. You know it with the same unshakable certainty of any man regarding the location of his own limbs, with that hard-wired awareness that needs no other confirmation. Against that conviction, what is reason? What is logic? Inside Rorschach, they had no place at all. On the sixth orbit, it acted. "It's talking to us," James said. Her eyes were wide behind the faceplate, but not bright, not manic. Around us, Rorschach's guts oozed and crawled at the corner of my eye. It still took effort to ignore the illusion. Foreign words scrabbled like small animals below my brainstem as I tried to focus on a ring of finger-sized protrusions that picketed a patch of wall. "It's not talking," Spindle said from across the artery. "You're hallucinating again." Bates said nothing. Two grunts hovered in the middle of the space, panning across three axes. "It's different this time," James insisted. "The geometry, it's not so symmetrical. Looks almost like the Phaistos disk." She spun slowly, pointed down the passage. "I think it's stronger down here."
"Bring Michelle out," Spindle suggested. "Maybe she can talk some sense into you."
James laughed weakly. "Never say die, do you?" She tweaked her pistol and coasted into deeper gloom. "Yes, it's definitely stronger here. There's content superimposed on—" Quick as a blink, Rorschach cut her off. I'd never seen anything move so fast before. There was none of the languor we'd grown accustomed to from Rorschach's septa, no lazy drift to contraction. The iris snapped shut in an instant. Suddenly, the artery just ended 3 meters ahead, with a matte black membrane filigreed in fine spiral. And the gang of four was on the other side. The grunts were on it immediately, lasers crackling through the air. Bates was yelling, "Get behind me! Stick to the walls!" kicking herself into space like an acrobat in fast forward, taking some tactical high ground that must have been obvious to her, at least. I edged toward the perimeter. Threads of superheated plasma sliced the air, shimmering. Spindle, at the corner of my eye, hugged the opposite side of the tunnel. The walls crawled. I could see the lasers taking a toll. The septum peeled back from their touch like burning paper, black, oily smoke writhing from its crisping edges, and sudden brightness everywhere. A riot of fractured light flooded the artery, a thousand shifting angles of incidence and reflection. It was like being trapped in the belly of a kaleidoscope pointed at the sun. Light, and needle-sharp pain in my side, in my left arm, the smell of charred meat, a scream cut off. "Susan? You there, Susan? We're taking you first." Around me, the light died. Inside me, a swarm of floaters mixed it up with the chronic half-visions Rorschach had already planted in my head. Alarms chirped irritatingly in my helmet. "Breach! Breach! Breach!" Until the smart fabric of the suit softened and congealed where the holes had been. Something stung maddeningly in my left side. I felt as if I'd been branded. "Keaton, check Spindle!" Bates had called off the lasers. The grunts closed for hand-to-hand, reaching with fiery nozzles and diamond-tipped claws to grapple with some prismatic material glowing softly behind that burnt-back skin. Fibrous reflector, I realized. It had shattered the laser light, turned it to luminous shrapnel, and thrown it back in our faces. Clever. But its surface was still alight, even with the lasers down. A diffuse glow, dipping and weaving, filtered through from the far side of the barrier while the drones chewed doggedly through the near one. After a moment, it struck me. James's headlamp. "Keaton!" Right, Spindle. His faceplate was intact. The laser had melted the Faraday mesh laminated onto the crystal, but the suit was sealing that tiny hole even now. The hole behind, drilled neatly through his forehead, remained. The eyes beneath stared at infinity. "Well?" Bates asked. She could read his vitals as easily as I, but Theseus was capable of post-mortem rebuilds. Barring brain damage. No. The whine of drills and shredders stopped. The ambiance brightened. I looked away from Spindle's remains. The grunts had cut a hole in the septum's fibrous underlayer. One of them nosed its way through to the other side. A new sound rose into the mix, a soft animal keening, haunted and dissonant. For a moment I thought Rorschach was whispering to us again. Its walls seemed to contract slightly around me. "James?" Bates snapped. "James!" Not James. A little girl in a woman's body in an armored spacesuit, scared out of her wits. The grunt nudged her curled up body back into our company. Bates took it gently. "Susan? Come back, Suze. You're safe." The grunts hovered restlessly, alert in every direction, pretending everything was under control. Bates spared me a glance. "Take Isaac," and turned back to James. "Susan?" "No," whimpered a small voice, a little girl's voice. "Michelle, is that you?" There was a thing," the little girl said. "It grabbed me. It grabbed my leg." "We're out of here." Bates pulled the gang back along the passage. One grunt lingered, watching the hole. The other took point. "It's gone," Bates said gently. "There's nothing there now. See the feed?" "You can't see it," Michelle whispered. It's invisible." The septum receded around a curve as we retreated. The hole torn through its center watched us like the ragged pupil of some great unblinking eye. It stayed empty as long as it stayed in sight. Nothing came out after us. Nothing we could see. A thought began cycling through my head, some half-assed eulogy stolen from an eavesdropped confessional, and try as I might, I couldn't shut it down. Isaac Spindle hadn't made the semifinals after all. Susan James came back to us on the way up. Isaac Spindle did not. We stripped wordlessly in the decon balloon. Bates, first out of her suit, reached for Spindle, but the gang stopped her with a hand and a headshake. Persone segued one into another as they stripped the body. Susan removed helmet and backpack and breastplate. Cruncher peeled away the silvery leaded skin from collar to toe. Sasha stripped the jumpsuit and left the pale flesh naked and exposed, except for the gloves. They left his feedback gloves in place, their fingertips forever tactile, the flesh inside forever numb. Through it all, Spindle stared, unblinking, beneath the hole in his forehead. His glazed eyes focused on distant quasars. I expected Michelle to appear in her turn and close them, but she never did. You have eyes, but you do not see. Jesus the Nazorian. I don't know how to feel about this, I thought. He was a good man. He was decent. He was kind to me, even when he didn't know I was listening in. I didn't know him long. He wasn't a friend exactly, but still, I should miss him. I should mourn. I should feel more than this sick, sinking fear that I could be next. Sarasti hadn't wasted any time. Spindle's replacement met us as we emerged, freshly thawed, nicotine-scented. The rehydration of his flesh was ongoing. Saline bladders clung to each thigh, although it would never entirely erase the sharpness of his features. His bones cracked when he moved. He looked past me and took the body. "Susan, Michelle, I—" The gang turned away. He coughed, began fumbling a body condom over the corpse. "Sarasti wants everyone in the drum." "We're hot," Bates said. Even cut short, the excursion had piled up a lethal sievert count. Faint nausea tickled the back of my throat. "Decontaminate later." One long pull of a zipper and Spindle was gone, engulfed in an oily gray shroud. "You," he turned in my direction, pointed at the scorched holes in my jumpsuit, "with me." Robert Cunningham. Another prototype. Dark-haired, hollow-cheeked, a jaw you could use as a ruler, both smoother and harsher than the man he had replaced. Where Spindle had ticked and jerked as if static charged, Cunningham's face held all the expression of a wax dummy's. The wetware that ran those muscles had been press-ganged into other pursuits. Even the tremors that afflicted the rest of his body were muted, soothed by the nicotine he drew with every second breath. He held no cigarette now. He held only the shrouded body of his hard-luck primary and his ongoing, freshly thawed distaste for the ship's synthesist. His fingers trembled. Bates and the gang moved silently up the spine. Cunningham and I followed, guiding the shroud of Spindle between us. My leg and side were stinging again, now that Cunningham had reminded them to. There wouldn't be much he could do about them, though. The beams would have cauterized the flesh on their way through, and if they'd hit anything vital, I'd have been dead already. At the hatch, we broke into single file, Spindle first, Cunningham pushing at his heels. By the time I emerged into the drum, Bates and the gang were already down on deck and taking their usual seats. Sarasti, in the flesh, watched them from the end of the conference table. His eyes were naked. From this angle, the soft, full-spectrum light of the drum washed the shine from them. If you didn't look too closely, for too long, you might almost think those eyes were human. Biomed had been spun down from my arrival. Cunningham pointed to a diagnostic couch on a section of the still deck that served as our infirmary. I floated over and strapped myself in. 2 meters away, past a waist-high guardrail that had risen from the deck, the rest of the room rolled smoothly past. It slung Bates and the gang and Sarasti around like weights on a string. I tapped consensus to hear them. James was speaking, quietly and without expression. I noticed a new pattern in the form constants. Something in the grating. It looked like a signal. It got stronger as I went down the tunnel. I followed it. I blacked out. I don't remember anything more until we were on our way back. Michelle filled me in as much as she could. That's all I know. I'm sorry. 100 degrees away in the no-G zone, Cunningham maneuvered his predecessor into a coffin, with different options than those up front. I wondered if it would embark on an autopsy during the debriefing. I wondered if we'd be able to hear the sounds it made. Sasha. Yeah. Sasha's trademark drawl infected the voice. I was writing, Mom. Went deaf-dumb and stark fucking blind when she passed out. I tried to take over, but something was blocking me. Michelle, I guess. Never thought she had it in her. I couldn't even see. But you don't lose consciousness. I was awake the whole time, far as I know. Just completely in the dark. Smell? Tactile? I could feel it when Michelle pissed in the suit, but I didn't notice anything else. Cunningham was back at my side. The inevitable cigarette had appeared between his lips. Nothing touches you, the vampire surmised. Nothing grabs your leg. No, Sasha said. She didn't believe Michelle's stories about invisible monsters. None of us did. Why bother when dementia could so easily explain anything we experienced? Cruncher. Don't know anything. I still wasn't used to the maleness of the voice now emanating from James's throat. Cruncher was a workaholic. He hardly ever surfaced in mixed company. You're there, Sarasti reminded him. You must remember some... Mom sent me patterns to parse. I was working on them. I'm still working on them, he added pointedly. I didn't notice anything. Is that all? I'd never been able to get a good read on him. Sometimes Cruncher seemed to have more in common with the dozens of non-conscious modules working in James's head than with sentient hubs comprising the rest of the gang. You feel nothing? Sarasti pressed. Just the patterns. Anything significant? Standard phenomath spirals and gratings, but I haven't finished. Can I go now? Yes. Call Michelle, please. Cunningham stabbed at my wounds with anabolizers, muttering to himself. Faint blue smoke curled between us. Isaac found some tumors, he observed. I nodded and coughed. My throat was sore. The nausea had grown heavy enough to sink below my diaphragm. Michelle, Sarasti repeated.
I see some more here, Cunningham continued, along the bottom of your brain pan. Only a few dozen cells so far. They're not worth burning yet.
Here. Michelle's voice was barely audible, even through consensus, but at least it was the voice of an adult. I'm here.
What do you remember, please?
I I felt I was just writing Mom, and then she was gone, and there was no one else, so I had to take over.
Do you see the septum close?
Not really. I felt it going dark, but when I turned around, we were already trapped. And then I felt something behind me. It wasn't loud or harsh. It just sort of bumped, and it grabbed me, and I'm sorry, she said after a moment. I'm a bit woozy.
Sarasti waited.
Isaac, Michelle whispered. He.
Yes. A pause. We are very sorry about that.
Maybe he can be fixed? Can he be fixed?
No. There's brain damage.
There was something like sympathy in the vampire's voice, the practiced affectation of an accomplished mimic. There was something else, too, an all but imperceptible hunger, a subtle edge of temptation. I don't think anyone heard it but me. We were sick and getting sicker. Predators are drawn to the weak and injured. Michelle had fallen silent again. When she continued, her voice only faltered a little.
I can't tell you much. It grabbed me. It let me go. I went to pieces, and I can't explain why except that fucking place just does things to you, and I was weak. I'm sorry. There's not much else to tell you.
Thank you, Sarasti said after a long moment.
Can I? I'd like to leave if that's okay.
Yes, Sarasti said.
Michelle sank below the surface as the commons rotated past. I didn't see who took her place. The grunts didn't see anything, Bates remarked. By the time we broke through the septum, the tunnel behind was empty. Any bogey would have had plenty of time to hightail, Cunningham said. He planted his feet on the deck and grabbed a handhold. The sub-drum began to move. I drifted obliquely against my restraints. I don't disagree, Bates said, but if there's anything we've learned about that place, it's that we can't trust our senses.
Trust Michelle's,
Sarasti said. He opened a window as I grew heavier, a grunt's eye view of a fuzzy, bright blob weaving behind the translucent waxed paper fibers of the skinned septum. James's headlight from the wrong side of the barrier. The image wobbled a bit as the drone staggered through some local pocket of magnetism, then replayed. Wobbled. Replayed. A 6-second loop.
See something next to the gang.
Non-vampires saw no such thing. Sarasti froze the image, evidently realizing as much.
Diffraction patterns aren't consistent with a single light source in open space. I see dimmer elements, reflective elements. Two dark objects close together, similar size, scattering light here. A cursor appeared at two utterly nondescript points on the image, and here. One's the gang, the other's unaccounted for.
Just a minute, Cunningham said. If you can see it through all that, why didn't Michelle see anything?
Synesthesiac, Sarasti reminded him. You see, she feels.
Biomed jerked slightly, locking into spin sync with the drum. The guardrail sank back into the deck. In some far-off corner, something without eyes watched me watching it. Shit, Bates whispered. There's someone home. Oh yeah, Shiske is spooky. Let me skip ahead here real quick. I'm trying to find a logical stopping point for today, which is a ways off, but I'm just trying to. Here we go. That's probably. We'll see what time we're at by the time we get to that point, and we'll go from there. Ugh. They never really talked like that, by the way. You'd hear gibberish A half dozen languages, a whole babble of personal idioms, if I spoke in their real voices. Some of the simpler tics make it through. Sasha's good-natured belligerence, Sarasti's aversion to the past tense. Cunningham lost most of his gender pronouns to an unforeseen glitch during the work on his temporal lobe. But it went beyond that. The whole lot of them threw English and Hindi and Hadzani into every second sentence. No real scientist would allow their thoughts to be hamstrung by the conceptual limitations of a single language. Other times they acted almost as synthesists in their own right, conversing in grunts and gestures that would be meaningless to any baseline. It's not so much that the bleeding edge lacks social skills, it's that once you get past a certain point, formal speech is too damn slow. Except for Susan James. The walking contradiction, the woman so devoted to communication as unifier that she'd cut her own brain into disunified chunks to make the point. She was the only one who ever seemed to care who she was talking to. The others spoke only for themselves, even when they spoke to each other. Even James's other cores would speak their own minds in their own way, and let everyone else translate as best they could. It wasn't a problem. Everyone on Theseus could read everyone else. But that didn't matter to Susan James. She fit each of her words to their intended recipient. She accommodated. I am a conduit. I exist to bridge the gap, and I'd bridge nothing if I only told you what these people said. So I am telling you what they meant, and it will mean as much to you as you can handle. Except for Susan James, linguist and ringleader, whom I trust to speak for herself. 15 minutes to apogee. Maximum safe distance in case Rorschach decided to hit back. Far below, the artifact's magnetic field pressed into Ben's atmosphere like God's little finger. Great dark thunderheads converged behind it. Turbulent moon-sized curlicues collided in its wake. 15 minutes to apogee, and Bates was still hoping Sarasti would change his mind. In a way, this was her fault. If she had just treated this new travail as one more cross to bear, perhaps things would have gone on more or less as before. There would have been some faint hope that Sarasti would have let us grit our teeth and keep on going, besieged by spring-loaded trapdoors as well as the usual gauntlet of sieverts and magnets and monsters from the id. But Bates had made an issue out of it. It wasn't just another piece of shit in the sewer to her, it was the one that clogged the pipe. We're on the brink as it is, just surviving the baseline environment of this thing. If it started taking deliberate countermeasures, I don't see how we can risk it. 14 minutes to apogee, and Amanda Bates was still regretting those words. On previous expeditions, we'd charted 26 septa in various stages of development. We'd x-rayed them. We'd done ultrasound. We'd watched them ooze their way across passages or ebb slowly back into the walls. The iris that had snapped shut behind the gang of four had been a whole different animal. And what are the odds that the first one with a hair trigger just happened to also come with anti-laser prismatics? That was no routine growth event. That thing was set for us. Set by... That was the other thing. 13 minutes to apogee, and Bates was worried about the tenants. It had always been breaking and entering, of course. That much hadn't changed. But when we'd jimmied the lock, we'd thought we were vandalizing an empty summer cottage, still under construction. We'd thought the owners would be out of the picture for a while. We hadn't been expecting one of them to catch us on his way to take a late-night piss. And now that one had, and vanished into the labyrinth, it was natural to wonder what weapons it might keep stashed under the pillow. Those septa could spring on us at any time. How many are there? Are they fixed or portable? We can't proceed without knowing these things. At first, Bates had been surprised and delighted when Sarasti agreed with her. 12 minutes to apogee. From this high ground, well above the static, Theseus peered down through Rorschach's wrenched and twisted anatomy to keep rock-steady eyes on the tiny wound we'd burned in its side. Our limpet tent covered it like a blister. Inside, Jack fed us a second first-person view of the unfolding experiment. Sir, We know Rorschach is inhabited. Do we want to risk further provoking the inhabitants? Do we want to risk killing them? Sarasti hadn't quite looked at her, and hadn't quite spoken. If he had, he might have said, I do not understand how meat like you survived to adulthood. 11 minutes to apogee, and Amanda Bates was lamenting the fact, not for the first time, that this mission was not under military jurisdiction. We were waiting for maximum distance before performing the experiment. Rorschach might interpret this as a hostile act, Sarasti had conceded in a voice that contained no trace of irony whatsoever. Now he stood before us, watching consensus play on the table. Reflections writhed across his naked eyes, not quite masking the deeper reflections behind them. 10 minutes to apogee. Susan James was wishing that Cunningham would put out that goddamn cigarette. The smoke stank on its way to the ventilators, and anyway, it wasn't necessary. It was just an anachronistic affectation, an attention-getting device. If he needed the nicotine, a patch could have soothed his tremors just as easily, without the smoke and the stink. That wasn't all she was thinking, though. She was wondering why Cunningham had been summoned to Sarasti's quarters earlier in the shift, why he'd looked at her so strangely afterward. I wondered about that myself. A quick check on consensus timestamps. Whoops. A quick check on consensus timestamps showed that her medical file had been accessed during that period. I checked those stats, let the shapes bounce between hemispheres. Part of my brain locked on elevated oxytocin as the probable reason for that conference. There was an 82% chance that James had become too trusting for Sarasti's liking. I had no idea how I knew that. I never did. 9 minutes to apogee. Barely a molecule of Rorschach's atmosphere had been lost on our account. That was all about to change. Our view of base camp split like a dividing bacterium. One window now focused on the limpet tent, the other on a wide-angle tactical enhance of the space around it. 8 minutes to apogee. Sarasti pulled the plug. Down on Rorschach, our tent burst like a bug beneath a boot. A geyser erupted from the wound. A snowstorm swirled at its edges, its charged curlicues intricate as lace. Atmosphere gushed into vacuum, spread thin, crystallized. Briefly, the space around the base camp sparkled. It was almost beautiful. Bates didn't think it was beautiful at all. She watched that bleeding wound with a face as expressionless as Cunningham's, but her jaw was clenched unto tetanus. Her eyes darted between views, watching for things gasping in the shadows. Rorschach convulsed. Vast trunks and arteries shuddered, a seismic tremor radiating out along the structure. The epicenter began to twist, a vast segment rotating on its axis, the breach midway along its length. Stress lines appeared where the length that rotated sheared against the lengths to either side that didn't. The structure seemed to soften and stretch there, constricting like a great elongate balloon torquing itself into sausage links. Sarasti clicked. Cats made something like that sound when they spied a bird on the far side of a window pane. Consensus groaned with the sound of worlds scraping against each other. Telemetry from the on-site sensors, their ears to the ground. Jack's camera controls had frozen again. The image it sent was canted and grainy. The pickup stared blankly at the edge of the hole we'd bored into the underworld. The groaning subsided. A final faint cloud of crystalline stardust dissipated into space, barely visible even on max enhance. No bodies. None visible, anyway. Sudden motion at base camp. At first, I thought it was static on Jack's feed, playing along lines of high contrast. But no, something was definitely moving along the edges of the hole we'd burned. Something almost wriggled there, a thousand gray mycelia, extruding from the cut surface and writhing slowly into the darkness. Huh, Bates said. Triggered by the pressure drop, I guess. That's one way to seal a breach. 2 weeks after we'd wounded it, Rorschach had begun to heal itself. Apogee behind us now. all downhill from there. Theseus began the long drop back into enemy territory. Doesn't use scepter, Sarasti said. Okay. Alright, so we've got some pretty interesting shit coming up. And there is a picture relevant to that I want to get up there in a very specific time frame. So give me 1 sec um, to get that prepped. If this thing will... I'm not gone. It says I'm gone, but I'm not. I promise. Where are you? Okay, here we go. I think that's the one. I'll have to adjust the size when the time comes, and I'll fake it at that point. Where are you? Yeah, that's it. I think. Yeah, that's it. Oh, yeah. Another second here. Almost got it. Okay. Size, and now I'm just going to space it so it's not completely spastic. Do 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 do. Here we go. There we go. All right, now I just have to make sure I get that at the appropriate time. I'm going to have to jockey images, and I just have to do that correctly. Okay. My genes done gone and tricked my brain by making fucking feel so great. That's how the little creeps attain their plan to fucking replicate. But brain's got tricks itself, you see, to get the bang but not the bite. I got this here vasectomy. My genes can fuck themselves tonight. The R selectors, trunklade. First-person sex, real sex, as Chelsea insisted on calling it, was an acquired taste. Jagged breathing, the raw slap and stink of sweaty skin full of pores and blemishes. A whole other person with a whole other set of demands and dislikes. There was definite animal appeal, no doubt about it. This was, after all, how we'd done it for millions of years. But this third world carnality had always carried an element of struggle, of asynchronous patterns in conflict. There was no convergence here. There was only the rhythm of bodies in collision, a struggle for dominance, each trying to force the other into sync. Chelsea regarded it as love in its purest form. I came to think of it as hand-to-hand combat. Before, whether fucking creations from my own menu or slip-on skins from someone else's, I had always selected the contrast and the res, the texture and the attitude. The bodily functions, the resistance of competing desires, the endless foreplay that wears your tongue to the root and leaves your face sticky and glistening. Just kinks today. Options for the masochistic. But there were no options with Chelsea. With her, everything came standard. I indulged her. I guess I was no more patient with her perversions than she was with my ineptitude at them. Other things made it worth the effort. Chelsea would argue about anything under the sun, wry and insightful and curious as a cat. She would pounce without warning. Retired to the redundant majority, she still took such simple joy in the very act of being alive. She was impulsive and impetuous. She cared about people. Pag. Me. She wanted to know me. She wanted in. That was proving to be a problem. We could try it again. she said once in an aftermath of sweat and pheromones, and you won't even remember what you were so upset about. You won't even remember you were upset if you don't want to. I smiled and looked away. Suddenly the planes of her face were coarse and unappealing. How many times is that now? 8? 9? I just want you to be happy, Sig. True happiness is one hell of a gift, and I can give it to you if you'll let me. You don't want me happy, I said pleasantly. You want me customized. She mmm'd into the hollow of my throat for a moment. Then, what? You just want to change me into something more accommodating. Chelsea lifted her head. Look at me. I turned my head. She'd shut down the chromatophores in her cheek. The tattoo, transplanted, fluttered now on her shoulder. Look at my eyes, Chelsea said. I looked at the imperfect skin around them, at the capillaries wriggling across the whites. I felt a distant bemusement that such flawed, decaying organs were still able to hypnotize me on occasion. Now, Chelsea said, what do you mean by that? I shrugged. You keep pretending this is a partnership. We both know it's a competition. A competition. You're trying to manipulate me into playing by your rules. What rules? The way you want the relationship run. I don't blame you, Chels, not in the least. We've been trying to manipulate each other for as long as, hell, it's not even human nature. It's mammalian. I don't believe it. She shook her head. Ropey tendrils of hair swung across her face. It's the middle of the 21st century and you're hitting me with this war of the sexes bullshit? Granted, your tweaks are a pretty radical iteration. Get right in there and reprogram your mate for optimum servility. You actually think I'm trying to housebreak you? You think I'm trying to train you like a puppy? You're just doing what comes naturally. I can't believe you pull this shit on me. I thought you valued honesty in relationships. What relationship? According to you, there's no such thing. This is just mutual rape or something. That's what relationships are. Don't pull that shit on me. She sat up, swung her feet over the edge of the bed, putting her back to me. I know how I feel. If I know anything, I know that much, and I only wanted to make you happy. I know you believe that, I said gently. I know it doesn't feel like a strategy. Nothing does when it's wired that deeply. It feels right. It feels natural. It's nature's trick. It's someone's fucking trick. I sat up next to her, let my shoulder brush hers. She leaned away. I know this stuff, I said after a while. I know how people work. It's my job. It was hers, too, for that matter. Nobody who spliced brains for a living could possibly be unaware of all that basic wiring in the sub-basement. Chelsea had simply chosen to ignore it. To have admitted anything would have compromised her righteous anger. I could have pointed that out too, I suppose, but I knew how much stress the system could take, and I wasn't ready to test it to destruction. I didn't want to lose her. I didn't want to lose that feeling of safety, that sense that it made a difference whether I lived or died. I only wanted her to back off a bit. I only wanted room to breathe. You can be such a reptile sometimes, she said. Mission accomplished. Oh, he's just so good with people. Our first approach had been all caution and safety margins. This time, we came in like a strike force. Scylla burned toward Rorschach at over 2G, its trajectory a smooth and predictable arc ending at the ruptured base camp. It may have even landed there for all I know. Perhaps Sarasti had two-birded the mission, programmed the shuttle for some collecting of its own. If so, it wouldn't land with us on board. Scylla spat us into space almost 50 kilometers short of the new beachhead, left us naked and plummeting on some wireframe contraption with barely enough reaction mass for a soft landing and a quick getaway. We didn't even have control over that. Success depended on unpredictability, and how better to ensure that than to not even know ourselves what we were doing? Sarasti's logic. Vampire logic. We could follow it part way. The colossal deformation that had sealed Rorschach's breach was so much slower, so much more expensive than the drop gate that had trapped the gang. The fact that drop gates hadn't been used implied that they took time to deploy, to redistribute necessary mass, perhaps, or spring load its reflexes. That gave us a window. We could still venture into the den so long as the lions couldn't predict our destination and set traps in advance, so long as we got out again before they could set them afterward. 37 minutes, Sarasti had said, and none of us could fathom how he'd come to that number. Only Bates had dared to ask aloud, and he had merely glinted at her. You can't follow. Vampire logic. From an obvious premise to an opaque conclusion. Our lives depended on it. The retros followed some pre-programmed algorithm that mated Newton with a roll of the dice. Our vector wasn't completely random. Once we'd eliminated raceways and growth zones, areas without line-of-sight escape routes, dead ends, and unbranched segments. Boring, Sarasti said, dismissing them. Barely 10% of the artifact remained in the running. Now we dropped toward a warren of brambles 8 kilometers from our original landing site. Here in the midst of our final approach, there was no way that even we could predict our precise point of impact. If Rorschach could, it deserved to win. We fell. Ridged spires and gnarled limbs sectioned the sky wherever I looked, cut the distant starscape and the imminent Super Jovian into a jagged mosaic veined in black. 3 kilometers away, or 30, the tip of some swollen extremity burst in a silent explosion of charged particles, a distant fog of ruptured, freezing atmosphere. Even as it faded, I could make out wisps and streamers swirling into complex spirals. Rorschach's magnetic field, sculpting the artifact's very breath into radioactive sleet. I'd never seen it with naked eyes before. I felt like an insect on a starry midwinter's night, falling through the aftermath of a forest fire. The sled fired its brakes. I snapped back against the webbing of my harness, bumped against the rebounding armored body next to me. Sasha. Only Sasha, I remembered. Cunningham had sedated the rest of them, left this one core lonely and alone in the group body. I hadn't even realized that that was possible with multiple personalities. She stared back at me from behind her faceplate. None of her surfaces showed through the suit. I could see nothing in her eyes. That was happening so often these days. Cunningham was not with us. Nobody had asked why when Sarasti assigned the berths. The biologist was first among equals now, a backup restored with no other behind him. The second least replaceable of our irreplaceable crew. It made me a better bargain. The odds I bought had increased to 1 in 3. A silent bump shuddered up the frame. I looked forward again, past Bates on the front pallet, past the anchored drones that flanked her 2 to each side. The sled had launched its assault, a prefab inflatable vestibule mounted on an explosive injection assembly that would punch through Rorschach's skin like a virus penetrating a host cell. The spindle-legged contraption dwindled and disappeared from my sight. Moments later, a pinpoint sodium sun flared and died against the ebony landscape ahead. Antimatter charge, so small you could almost count the atoms, shot directly into the hull. A lot rougher than the tentative foreplay of our first date. We landed, hard, while the vestibule was still inflating. The grunts were off the sled an instant before contact, spitting tiny puffs of gas from their nozzles, arranging themselves around us in a protective rosette. Bates was up next, leaping free of her restraints and sailing directly toward the swelling hab. Sasha and I unloaded the fiber-op hub, a clamshell drum 1/2 meter thick and 3 times as wide, lugging it between us while one of the grunts slipped through the vestibule's membranous airlock. "Let's move, people!" Bates was hanging off of one of the inflatable's handholds. 30 minutes to... She fell silent. I didn't have to ask why. The advanced grunt had positioned itself over the newly blasted entrance, and sent back its first postcard. Light from below. You'd think that would have made it easier. Our kind has always feared the dark. For millions of years we huddled in caves and burrows while unseen things snuffled and growled, or just waited, silent and undetectable, in the night beyond. You'd think that any light, no matter how meager, might strip away some of the shadows, leave fewer holes for the mind to fill in with worst imaginings. You'd think. We followed the grunt down into a dim, soupy glow like blood-curdled milk. At first it seemed as though the atmosphere itself was alight, a luminous fog that obscured anything more than 10 meters distant. An illusion, as it turned out. The tunnel we emerged into was about 3 meters wide and lit by rows of raised glowing dashes, the size and approximate shape of dismembered human fingers, wound in a loose triple helix around the walls. We'd recorded similar ridges at the first site, although the breaks had not been so pronounced and the ridges had been anything but luminous. Stronger in the near infrared, Bates reported, flashing the spectrum to our HUDs. The air would have been transparent to pit vipers. It was transparent to sonar. The lead grunt sprayed the fog with click trains and discovered that the tunnel widened into some kind of chamber 17 meters farther along. Squinting in that direction, I could just make out subterranean outlines through the mist. I could just make out jawed things pulling back out of sight. "Let's go," Bates said. We plugged in the grunts, left one guarding the way out. Each of us took another as a guardian angel on point. The machines spoke to our HUDs via laser link. They spoke to each other along stiffened lengths of shielded fiber op that unspooled from the hub trailing in our wake. It was the best available compromise in an environment without any optima. Our tethered bodyguards would keep us all in touch during lone excursions around corners or down dead ends. Yeah, lone excursions. Forced to either split the group or cover less ground, we were told we were to split the group. We were speed cartographers panning for gold. Everything we did here was an act of faith. Faith that the unifying principles of Rorschach's internal architecture could be derived from the raw dimensions we'd grab on the run. Faith that Rorschach's internal architecture even had unifying principles. Earlier generations had worshipped malign and capricious spirits. Ours put its faith in an ordered universe. Here, in the devil's baklava, it was easy to wonder if our ancestors hadn't been closer to the mark. We moved along the tunnel. Our destination resolved to merely human eyes, not so much chamber as nexus, a knot of space formed by the convergence of a dozen tunnels angling in from different orientations. Ragged meshes of quicksilver dots gleamed along several glistening surfaces. Shiny protrusions poked through the substrate like a scattershot blast of ball bearings pressed into wet clay. I looked at Bates and Sasha. "Control panel?" Bates shrugged. Her drones panned the throats around us, spraying sonar down each. My HUD sketched a patchy 3D model from the echoes, swaths of paint thrown against invisible walls. We were dots near the center of a ganglion, a tiny swarm of parasites infesting some great hollowed host. Each tunnel curved away in a gradual spiral, each along a different orientation. Sonar could peep around those bends a few meters farther than we could. Neither eyes nor ultrasonics saw anything to distinguish one choice from another. Bates pointed down one of the passageways, "Keaton," and another, "Sasha," before turning to coast off down her own unbeaten path. I looked uneasily down mine. "Any particular 25 minutes, she said. I turned and jetted slowly down my assigned passageway. The passage curved clockwise, a long, unremarkable spiral. After 20 meters, that curvature would have blocked any view of its entrance, even if the foggy atmosphere hadn't. My drone kept point across the tunnel, its sonar clicking like the chattering of 1,000 tiny teeth, its tether unspooling back to the distant drum in the nexus. It was a comfort, that leash. It was short. The grunts could stray 90 meters and no farther, and we were under strict orders to stay under their wings at all times. This dim, infested burrow might lead all the way to hell, but I would not be expected to follow it nearly so far. My cowardice had official sanction. 50 meters to go. 50 meters, and I could turn and run with my tail between my legs. In the meantime, all I had to do was grit my teeth and focus and record. Everything you see, Sarasti had said, as much as possible of what you can't. And hope that this new reduced time limit would expire before Rorschach spiked us into gibbering dementia. The walls around me twitched and shivered like the flesh of something just killed. Something darted in and out of sight with a faint cackle of laughter. Focus. Record. If the grunt doesn't see it, it's not real. 65 meters in, one of the ghosts got inside my helmet. I tried to ignore it. I tried to look away. But this phantom wasn't flickering at the edge of vision. It hovered near the center of my faceplate, floating like a spot of swirling dizziness between me and the HUD. I gritted my teeth and tried to look past, stared into the dim, bloody haze of the middle distance, watched the jerky, unfolding travelogues in the little windows labeled Bates and James. Nothing out there. But in here, floating before my eyes, Rorschach's latest head fuck smeared a fuzzy thumbprint right in front of the sonar feed. New symptom, I called in. Non-peripheral hallucination. Stable, pretty formless though. No spiking that I can... The inset marked Bates skidded hard about. Keat! Window and voice cut out together. Not just Bates's window either. Sasha's inset and the drone's eye sonarscape flickered and died at the same moment, stripping my HUD bare except for in-suit feeds and a little red readout flashing "Link down." I spun, but the grunt was still there, 3 meters off my right shoulder. Its optical port was clearly visible, a ruby thumbnail set into the plastron. Its gun ports were visible too, pointing at me. I froze. The drone shivered in some local electromagnetic knot as if terrified. Of me, or of something behind me. I started to turn, my helmet filled with sudden static, and with what sounded, faintly, like a voice. King move, Keat, not Bates. Bates? Another icon had bloomed in place of Link down. The grunt was using radio for some reason, and though almost close enough to touch, I could barely make out the signal. A hash of Bates speak. To your right in front of... And Sasha as well, a bit more clearly. Auntie, see it! See what? Sasha? Someone tell me what? See what? Read? Keaton, do you read? Somehow Bates had boosted the signal. Static roared like an ocean, but I could hear the words behind it. Yes, what? Keep absolutely still, do you understand? Absolutely still. Acknowledge. Acknowledged. The drone kept me in its shaky sights, dark stereocam irises spasming wide, stuttering to pinpoints. What? There's something in front of you, Keaton. Directly between you and the grunt. Can't you see it? No, my HUD's down. Sasha broke in. How can he not see it? It's right there. Bates barked over. It's man-sized, radially symmetrical, 8, 9 arms. Like tentacles, but segmented. Spiky. I don't see anything, I said. But I did. I saw something reaching for me in my pod back aboard Theseus. I saw something curled up motionless in the ship's spine, watching as we laid our best plans. I saw Michelle in the synesthesiac, curled into a fetal ball. You can't see it. It's invisible. What's it doing? I called. Why can't I see it? Why can't I see it? Just floating there, kind of waving. Oh, shit. Keat? The grunt skidded sideways as if slapped by a giant hand. It bounced off the wall, and suddenly the laser link was back, filling the HUD with intelligence. First-person perspectives of Bates and Sasha racing along alien tunnels, a grunt's eye view of a spacesuit with Keaton stenciled across its breastplate, and there, right beside it, some thing like a rippling starfish with too many arms. The gang barreled around the curve, and now I almost could see something with my own eyes, flickering like heat lightning off to one side. It was large, and it was moving, but somehow my eyes just slid off every time they tried to get a fix. It's not real, I thought, giddy with hysterical relief. It's just another hallucination. But then Bates sailed into view, and it was right there. No flickering, no uncertainty, nothing but a collapsed probability wave and solid, undeniable mass. Exposed, it grabbed the nearest wall and scrambled over our heads, segmented arms flailing like whips. A sudden crackling buzz in the back of my head, and it was drifting free again, charred and smoking. A stuttering click, the whine of machinery gearing down. Three grunts hovered in formation in the middle of the passageway. One faced the alien. I glimpsed the tip of some lethal proboscis sliding back into its sheath. Bates shut the grunt down before it had finished closing its mouth. Optical links and 3 sets of lungs filled my helmet with a roar of heavy breathing. The offlined grunt drifted in the murky air. The alien carcass bumped gently off the wall, twitching. A hydra of human backbones, scorched and fleshless. It didn't look much like my onboard visions after all. For some reason I couldn't put my finger on, I found that almost reassuring. The two active grunts panned the fog until Bates gave them new orders. Then one turned to secure the carcass, the other to steady its fallen comrade. Bates grabbed the dead grunt and unplugged its tether. Fall back, slowly. I'm right behind you. I tweaked my jets. Sasha hesitated. Coils of shielded cable floated about us like umbilical cords. Now, Bates said, plugging a feed from her own suit directly into the offlined grunt. Sasha started after me. Bates took up the rear. I watched my HUD. A swarm of multi-armed monsters would appear there any moment. But they didn't. But the blackened thing against the belly of Bates's machine was real enough. Not a hallucination. Not even some understandable artifact of fear and synesthesia. Rorschach was inhabited. Its inhabitants were invisible. Sometimes. Sort of. And, oh yeah, we'd just killed one. So that's an image of them poking around through Rorschach, and then there's one more here. That's pretty good. I wish I'd had this on previous excursions. And then there's one here, which I think is indicative of the critter itself. Yeah, there we go. Boom. Boom. A scurry. A scurry critter. Bates threw the deactivated grunt into the sky as soon as we'd made vacuum. Its comrades used it for target practice while we strapped in, firing and firing until there was nothing left but cooling vapor. Rorschach spun even that faint plasma into filigree before it faded. Halfway back to Theseus, Sasha turned to the Major. You... No. But they do shit on their own, right? Autonomous. Not when they're slaved. Malfunction? Spike? Bates didn't answer. She called ahead. By the time we made it back, Cunningham had grown another little tumor on Theseus's spine, a remote surgery packed with teleops and sensors. One of the surviving grunts grabbed the carcass and jumped ship as soon as we passed beneath the carapace, completing the delivery as we docked. We were born again into the fruits of a preliminary necropsy. The holographic ghost of the dissected alien rose from consensus like some flayed and horrific feast. Its splayed arms looked like human spinal columns. We sat around the table and waited for someone else to take the first bite.
Did you have to shoot it with microwaves? Cunningham sniped, tapping the table. You completely cooked the animal. Every cell was blown out from the inside.
Bates shook her head. There was a malfunction. He gave her a sour look.
A malfunction that just happens to involve precise targeting of a moving object. It doesn't sound random to me.
Bates looked back evenly. Something flipped autonomous targeting from off to on. A coin toss. Random.
Random is...
Give it a rest, Cunningham. I don't need this shit from you right now. His eyes rolled in that smooth, dead face, focused suddenly on something overhead. I followed his gaze. Sarasti stared down at us like an owl panning for meadow voles, drifting slowly in the Coriolis breeze. No visor this time, either. I knew he hadn't lost it. He fixed Cunningham. Your findings. Cunningham swallowed. Bits and pieces of alien anatomy flickered with color-coded highlights as he tapped his fingers.
Right then. I'm afraid I can't give you much at the cellular level. There's not much left inside the membranes. Not many membranes left, for that matter. In terms of gross morphology, the specimen's dorso-ventrally compressed and radially symmetrical, as you can see. Calcareous exoskeleton, keratinized plastic cuticle. Nothing special.
Bates looked skeptical. Plastic skin is nothing special?
Given the environment, I was half expecting a frickadoodle. Sanduloviciu plasma. Plastics simply refined petroleum. Organocarbon. This thing is carbon-based. It's even protein-based, although its proteins are a great deal tougher than ours. Numerous sulfur cross-bonds for lateral bracing, as far as I could tell from what your grunts didn't denature.
Cunningham's eyes looked past us all. His consciousness was obviously far aft, haunting remote sensors.
The thing's tissues are saturated with magnetite. On Earth, you find that material in dolphin brains, migratory birds, even some bacteria, anything that navigates or orients using magnetic fields. Moving up to macrostructures, we've got a pneumatic internal skeleton, which, as far as I can tell, doubles as musculature. Contractile tissue squeezes gas through a system of bladders that stiffen or relax each segment in the arms.
The light came back into Cunningham's eyes long enough to focus on his cigarette. He brought it to his mouth, dragged deeply, set it down again.
Note the invaginations around the base of each arm.
Flaccid balloons glowed orange on the virtual carcass.
Cloacae, you could call them. Everything opens into them. They eat, breathe, and defecate through the same little compartment. No other major orifices.
The gang made a face that said Sasha, grossed out. Don't things get clogged up? Seems inefficient.
If one gets plugged, there's 8 other doors into the same system. You'll wish you were so inefficient the next time you choke on a chicken bone.
What does it eat? Bates asked.
I couldn't say. I found gizzard-like contractiles around the cloacae, which implies they chew on something, or did at some point in their history. Other than that...
He spread his hands. The cigarette left faint streamers in its wake.
Inflate those contractiles enough and you create an airtight seal, by the way. In conjunction with the cuticle, that would allow this organism to survive briefly in vacuum. And we already know it can handle the ambient radiation, although don't ask me how. Whatever it uses for genes must be a great deal tougher than ours.
So it can survive in space, Bates mused. in the sense that a dolphin survives underwater. Limited time only.
How long?
I'm not certain.
Central nervous system, Sarasti said. Bates and the gang grew suddenly, subtly still. James's affect seeped out over her body, supplanting Sasha's. Smoke curled from Cunningham's mouth and nose.
There's nothing central about it, as it transpires. No cephalization, not even clustered sense organs. The body's covered with something like eye spots or chromatophores or both. There are setae everywhere. As far as I can tell, if all those little cooked filaments I've been able to put back together after your malfunction really are nerves and not something completely different, every one of those structures is under independent control.
Bates sat up straight. Seriously?
He nodded. It would be akin to independently controlling the movement of each individual hair on your head, although this creature is covered with little hairs from tip to tip. The same thing applies to the eyes. Hundreds of thousands of eyes all over the cuticle. Each one is barely more than a pinhole camera, but each is capable of independent focus, and I'm guessing all the different inputs integrate somewhere up the line. The entire body acts like a single diffuse retina. In theory, that gives it enormous visual acuity.
A distributed telescope array, Bates murmured.
A chromatophore underlies each eye. The pigment's some kind of cryptochrome, so it's probably involved in vision, but it can also diffuse or contract through the local tissue. That implies dynamic pigment patterns like a squid or a chameleon.
Background pattern matching? Bates asked. Would that explain why Siri couldn't see it? Cunningham opened a new window and played grainy, looped imagery of Siri Keaton and his unseen dance partner. The creature I hadn't noticed was ominously solid to the cameras. A floating discoid twice as wide as my own torso, arms extending from its edges like thick, knotted ropes. Patterns rippled across its surface in waves, sunlight and shadow playing on a shallow seabed.
As you can see, the background doesn't match the pattern, Cunningham said. It's not even close.
Can you explain Siri's blindness to it? Sarasti said.
I can't, Cunningham admitted. It's beyond ordinary crypsis. But Rorschach makes you see all sorts of things that aren't there. Not seeing something that is there might come down to essentially the same thing.
Another hallucination? I asked. Another shrug while Cunningham sucked smoke.
There are many ways to fool the human visual system. It's interesting that the illusion failed when multiple witnesses were present, but if you want a definitive mechanism, you'll have to give me more to work with than that.
He stabbed his cigarette hand at the crisped remains. But, James took a breath, bracing herself, we're talking about something sophisticated, at least. Something very complex. A great deal of processing power. Cunningham nodded again.
I'd estimate nervous tissue accounts for about 30% of body mass.
So it's intelligent. Her voice was almost a whisper.
Not remotely.
But 30%?
30% motor and sensory wiring.
Another drag.
Much like an octopus. An enormous number of neurons, but half of them get used up running the suckers.
My understanding is that octopi are quite intelligent, James said.
By molluscan standards, certainly. But do you have any idea how much extra cabling you'd need if the photoreceptors in your eye were spread across your entire body? You'd need about 300 million extension cords to begin with, ranging from half a millimeter to 2 meters long. Which means all your signals are staggered and out of sync, which means billions of additional logic gates to cohere the input. And that just gets you a single static image, with no filtering, no interpretation, no time series integration at all.
Shiver. Drag.
Now multiply that by all the extra wiring needed to focus all those eye spots on an object, or to send all that information back to individual chromatophores, and then add in the processing power you need to drive those chromatophores one at a time. 30% might do all that, but I strongly doubt you'd have much left over for philosophy and science.
He waved his hand in the general direction of the hold.
That That
Scrambler, James suggested. Cunningham rolled his tongue around it.
Very well. That scrambler is an absolute miracle of evolutionary engineering. It's also dumb as a stick.
A moment's silence.
So what is it?
James asked at last. Somebody's pet?
Canary in a coal mine, Bates suggested. Perhaps not even that, Cunningham said. Perhaps no more than a white blood cell with Waldos. Maintenance bot, maybe. Teleoperated or instinct driven. But people, we're ignoring far greater questions here. How could an anaerobe ever develop complex multicellular anatomy, much less move as fast as this thing did? That level of activity burns a great deal of ATP.
Maybe they don't use ATP, Bates said as I thumbnailed. Adenosine triphosphate, cellular energy source.
It was crammed with ATP, Cunningham told her. You can tell that much even with these remains. The question is, how can it synthesize the stuff fast enough to keep up with demand? Purely anaerobic pathways wouldn't suffice.
Nobody offered any suggestions.
Anyway, he said, so endeth the lesson. If you want gory details, check consensus.
He wiggled the fingers of his free hand. The spectral dissection vanished.
I'll keep working, but if you want any real answers, go get me a live one.
He butted out his cigarette against the bulkhead and stared defiantly around the drum. The others hardly reacted. Their topologies still sparkled from the revelations of a few minutes before. Perhaps Cunningham's pet peeve was more important to the big picture. Perhaps, in a reductionist universe, biochemical basics should always take priority over the finer points of ETI and interspecies etiquette. But Bates and the gang were time-lagged, processing earlier revelations. Not just processing, either. Wallowing. They clung to Cunningham's findings like convicted felons who'd just discovered they might be freed on a technicality. Because the Scrambler was dead at our hands, no doubt about it. But it wasn't an alien, not really. It wasn't intelligent. It was just a blood cell with Waldos. It was dumb as a stick. And property damage is so much easier to live with than murder. Whew. So we got aliens, boys. And girls, presumably. If I've got an audience at all. It is multigender. Oh, sugar. I need to find where I put, Oh, I know where it is. I know where it is. Mistakes were made. I didn't plan this whole switching things around thing. I didn't plan it out very well at all. In terms of background images, I mean. Okay. Let's get you up there. Let's get you over there. Let's centralize. Oh, I'm going the wrong way, naturally. These are not easy to do. I am not as smart as I look, apparently. There we go. That'll do. That'll do for now. And presto. Hey, yes. All right, we're good. Okay. Right back at it. Problems cannot be solved at the same level of awareness that created them. Albert Einstein. Robert Peglino had set me up with Chelsea in the first place. Maybe he felt responsible when the relationship started jumping the rails. Or maybe Chelsea, Madame Fix-It that she was, had approached him for an intervention. For whatever reason, it was obvious the moment we took our seats at Q-Bits that his invitation had not been entirely social. He went for some neurotrope cocktail on the rocks. I stuck with Rickards. Still old school, Pag said. Still into foreplay, I observed. That obvious, huh? He took a sip. That'll teach me to try the subtle approach with a professional jargonaut. Jargonaut's got nothing to do with it.
You wouldn't have fooled a border collie. Truth be told, Pag's topology never really told me much that I didn't already know. I never really had much of an edge in reading him. Maybe we just knew each other too well. So, he said, spill. Nothing to spill. She just got to know the real me. That is bad. What did she tell you? Me? Nothing at all. I gave him a look over the top of my glass. He sighed. She knows you're cheating on her. I'm what? Cheating? With the skin? It's based on her. But it isn't her. No, it isn't. It doesn't fart or fight or break into tears every time you don't want to be dragged off to meet its family. Look, I love the woman dearly, but come on. When was the last time you tried first person fucking? 74, he said. You're kidding. I'd have guessed never. Did some third world medical missionary work between gigs. They still bump and grind in Texas. Pag swigged his trope. Actually, I thought it was all right. The novelty wears off. Evidently. And it's not like I'm doing anything unusual here, Pag. She's the one with the kink. And it's not just the sex. She keeps wanting to know things. Like what? Irrelevant stuff. My life as a kid, my family. Nobody's fucking business. She's just taken an interest. Not everyone considers childhood memories off limits, you know. Thanks for the insight. As if people had never taken an interest before. As if Helen hadn't taken an interest when she went through my drawers and filtered my mail and followed me from room to room, asking the drapes and the furniture why I was always so sullen and withdrawn. She'd taken such an interest that she wouldn't let me out the door until I confided in her. At 12, I'd been stupid enough to throw myself on her mercy. It's personal, Mom. I'd rather just not talk about it. Then I'd made my escape into the bathroom when she demanded to know if it was trouble online, trouble at school, was it a girl, was it a boy? What was it, and why couldn't I just trust my own mother? Don't I know I can just trust her with anything? I waited out the persistent knocking and the insistent concerned voice through the door and the final, grudging silence that followed. I waited until I was absolutely sure she'd gone away. I waited for 5 fucking hours before I came out, and there she was, arms folded in the hall, eyes brimming with reproach and disappointment. That night she took the lock off the bathroom door because family should never shut each other out. Still taking an interest. Siri, Pag said quietly. I slowed my breathing. Tried again. She doesn't just want to talk about family. She wants to meet them. She keeps trying to drag me to meet hers. I thought I was hooking up with Chelsea, you know? Nobody ever told me I'd have to share airspace with... You do it? Once. Reaching, grasping things, feigning acceptance, feigning friendship. It was great if you like being ritually pawed by a bunch of play-acting strangers who can't stand the sight of you and don't have the guts to admit it. Pag shrugged, unsympathetic. Sounds like typical old school family. You're a synthesist, man. You deal with way wonkier dynamics than that. I deal with other people's information. I don't vomit my own personal life into the public sphere. Whatever hybrids and the constructs I work with, they don't touch. Interrogate, I finished. You knew Chelsea was an old-fashioned girl right off the top. Yeah, when it suits her. I gulped ale. But she's cutting edge when she's got a splicer in her hand, which isn't to say that her strategies couldn't use some work. Strategies. It's not a strategy, for God's sake. Can't you see I'm hurting? I'm on the fucking floor, Siri. I'm curled up in a ball because I'm hurting so much, and all you can do is criticize my tactics? What do I have to do? Slash my goddamn wrists? I'd shrugged and turned away. Nature's trick. She cries, I said now. High blood lactate levels makes it easy for her. It's just chemistry, but she holds it up like it was some kind of IOU. Pag pursed his lips. Doesn't mean it's an act. Everything's an act. Everything's strategy. You know that. I snorted. And she's miffed because I base a skin on her? I don't think it's so much the actual skin as the fact that you didn't tell her. You know how she feels about honesty in relationships. Sure, she doesn't want any. He looked at me. Give me some credit, Pag. You think I should tell her that sometimes the sight of her makes me shudder? The system, called Robert Paglino, sat quietly and sipped his drugs and set the things he was about to say in order. He took a breath. I can't believe you could be so fucking dumb, he said. Yeah? Enlighten me. Of course she wants you to tell her you only have eyes for her. You love her pores and her morning breath. And why stop at one tweak? How about 10? But that doesn't mean she wants you to lie, you idiot. She wants all that stuff to be true. And, well, why can't it be? It isn't, I said. Jesus, Siri. People aren't rational. You aren't rational. We're not thinking machines. We're feeling machines that happen to think. He took a breath and another hit. And you already know that, or you couldn't do your job. Or at least, he grimaced, the system knows. The system. Me and my protocols, he meant. My Chinese room. I took a breath. It doesn't work with everyone, you know. So I've noticed. Can't read systems you're too entangled with, right? Observer effect. I shrugged. Just as well, he said. I don't think I'd like you all that much in that room of yours. It came out before I could stop it. Chell says she'd prefer a real one. He raised his eyebrows. Real what? Chinese room. She says it would have better comprehension. The cube murmured and clattered around us for a few moments. I could see why she'd say that, Peg said at last. But you did okay, Podman. I don't know. He nodded, emphatic. You know what they say about the road less traveled? Well, you carved your own road. I don't know why. It's like learning calligraphy using your toes, you know? Or proprioceptive polyneuropathy. It's amazing you can do it at all. It's mind-boggling that you actually got good at it. I squinted at him. Proprio... There used to be people without any sense of, well, themselves physically. They couldn't feel their bodies in space, had no idea how their own limbs were arranged, or even if they had limbs. Some of them said they felt pithed, disembodied. They'd send a motor signal to the hand and just have to take it on faith that it arrived. So they'd use vision to compensate. They couldn't feel where the hand was, so they'd look at it while it moved. Use sight as a substitute for the normal force feedback you and I take for granted. They could walk if they kept their eyes focused on their legs and concentrated on every step. They'd get pretty good at it. But even after years of practice, if you distracted them in mid-step, they'd go over like a beanstalk without a counterweight. You're saying I'm like that? You and your Chinese room, you use your Chinese room the way they used vision. You've reinvented empathy almost from scratch, and in some ways, not all obviously, or I wouldn't have to tell you this, but in some ways, yours is better than the original. That's why you're so good at synthesis. I shook my head. I just observe, that's all. I watch what people do, and then I imagine what would make them do that. Sounds like empathy to me. It's not. Empathy's not so much about imagining how the other guy feels. It's more about imagining how you'd feel in the same place, right? Pag frowned. So? So, what if you don't know how you'd feel? He looked at me, and his surfaces were serious and completely transparent. You're better than that, friend. You may not always act like it, but I know you. I knew you before. You knew someone else. I'm Podman, remember? Yeah, that was someone else. And maybe I remember him better than you do. But I'll tell you one thing. He leaned forward. Both of you would have helped me out that day. And maybe he would have got there with a good old-fashioned empathy while you had to cobble together some kind of improvised flowchart out of surplus parts. But that just makes your accomplishment all the greater, which is why I continue to stick it out with you, old buddy. Even though you have a rod up your ass the size of the Rio Spire. He held out his glass. Dutifully, I clinked it against my own. We drank. I don't remember him, I said after a while. What, the other Siri? Pre-pod Siri? I nodded. Nothing at all? I thought back. Well, he was racked by convulsions all the time, right? There'd be constant pain. I don't remember any pain. My glass was almost empty. I sipped to make it last. I I dream about him sometimes, though. About being him. What's it like? It was colorful. Everything was more saturated, you know? Sounds, smells, richer than life. And now? I looked at him. You said that was colorful. What changed? I don't know. Maybe nothing. I just, I don't actually remember the dreams when I wake up anymore. So how do you know you still have them? Pag asked. Fuck it, I thought, and tipped back the last of my pint in a single gulp. I know. How? I frowned, taken aback. I had to think for a few moments before I remembered. I wake up smiling, I said. All right, what are we looking at time-wise? I think we're okay. Yeah. And that leaves us basically with 2 more sessions. Yep, okay. 1 sec, I'm going to get my auxiliary water here. I hope people are enjoying this. This is a blast. I'm sorry I'm not super consistent on the voices. I swear to God I'm trying. It's not easy. I had to realize, oh yeah, Cunningham's a smoker, so I have to have a raspy throat, and it's killing me. Oh God, it hurts. Ah, hmm, that's right, water bottle. Piddle all over me. Blech. Okay, let's readjust our positioning here. Grunts look the enemy in the eye. Grunts know the stakes. Grunts know the price of poor strategy. What do the generals know? Overlays and tactical plots. The whole chain of command is upside down. Kenneth Lubin, Zero Sum. It went bad from the moment we breached. The plan had called for precise havoc along the new beachhead, subtly arranged to entrap some blood cell with Waldos as it sought to repair the damage. Our job had been to set the trap and stand back, trusting Sarasti's assurances that we would not have long to wait. We had no time at all. Something squirmed in the swirling dust the moment we breached, serpentine movement down the hole that instantly kicked Bates's renowned field initiative into high gear. Her grunts dived through and caught a scrambler twitching in their crosshairs, clinging to the wall of the passageway. It must have been stunned by the blast of our entry, a classic case of wrong place, wrong time. Bates took a split second to appraise the opportunity, and the plan was plasma. One of the grunts plugged the scrambler with a biopsy dart before I even had a chance to blink. We would have bagged the whole animal right then if Rorschach's magnetosphere hadn't chosen that moment to kick sand in our faces. As it was, by the time our grunts staggered back into action, their quarry was already disappearing around the bend. Bates was tethered to her troops. They yanked her down the rabbit hole. "Set it up!" she yelled back at Sasha, the moment she let them loose. I was tethered to Bates. I barely had a chance to exchange a wide-eyed look with Sasha before being yanked away in turn. Suddenly, I was inside again. The sated biopsy dart bounced off my faceplate and flashed past, still attached to a few meters of discarded monofilament. Hopefully, Sasha would pick it up while Bates and I were hunting. At least the mission wouldn't be a total loss if we never made it back. The grunts dragged us like bait on a hook. Bates flew like a dolphin just ahead of me, keeping effortlessly to the center of the bore with an occasional tweak of her jets. I careened off the walls just behind, trying to stabilize myself, trying to look as though I too might be in control. There was an important pretense. It was an important pretense. The whole point of being a decoy is to pass yourself off as an original. They'd even given me my own gun. Pure precaution, of course, more for comfort than protection. It hugged my forearm and fired plastic slugs impervious to induction fields. Just Bates and I now. A pacifist soldier and the odds of a coin toss. Goose flesh prickled my skin as it always had. The usual ghosts crabbled and clawed through my mind. This time, though, the dread seemed muted, distant. Perhaps it was just a matter of timing. Perhaps we were moving so quickly through the magnetic landscape that no one phantom had a chance to stick. Or maybe it was something else. Maybe I wasn't so afraid of ghosts because this time we were after monsters. The scrambler seemed to have thrown off whatever cobwebs our entrance had spun. It surged along the walls now at full speed, its arms shooting ahead like a succession of striking snakes, slinging the body forward so fast the drones could barely keep it in sight, a writhing silhouette in the fog. Suddenly, it leaped sideways, sailing across the width of the passageway and down some minor tributary. The grunts veered in pursuit, crashing into walls, stumbling, stopping. And suddenly, Bates was braking hard, shooting back past me as I flailed with my pistol. I was past the drones in the next instant. My leash snapped tight and snapped back, bringing me to a dead, drifting stop. For a second or two, I was on the front line. For a second or two, I was the front line. Siri Keaton, note taker, mole, professional uncomprehender. Uncomprehender. I just floated there, breath roaring in my helmet as a few meters farther on the walls squirmed. Peristalsis, I thought at first, but this motion was utterly unlike the slow, undulating waves that usually rippled along Rorschach's passageways. So, hallucination, I thought instead. And then those writhing walls reached out with 1,000 whip-like calcareous tongues that grabbed our quarry from every direction and tore it to pieces. Something grabbed me and spun me around. Suddenly, I was locked against the chest of one of the grunts, its rear guns firing as we retreated back up the tunnel at full speed. Bates was in the arms of the other. Seething motion receded behind us, but the image stayed stuck to the backs of my eyes, hallucinatory and point blank in its clarity. Scramblers everywhere. A seething infestation squirming across the walls, reaching out for the intruder, leaping into the lumen of the passageway to press their counterattack. Not against us. They had attacked one of their own. I had seen 3 of its arms ripped off before it had disappeared into a writhing ball at the center of the passageway. We fled. I turned to Bates. "Did you see?" but held my tongue. The deathly concentration on her face was unmistakable, even across 2 faceplates and 3 meters of methane. According to HUD, she'd lobotomized both grunts, bypassed all that wonderful autonomous decision-making circuitry entirely. She was running both machines herself, as manually as marionettes. Grainy, turbulent echoes appeared on the rear sonar display. The scramblers had finished with their sacrifice. Now they were coming after us. My grunt stumbled and careened against the side of the passage. Jagged shards of alien decor dug parallel gouges across my faceplate, tenderized chunks of thigh through the shielded fabric of my suit. I clenched down on a cry. It got out anyway. Some ridiculous in-suit alarm chirped indignantly an instant before a dozen rotten eggs broke open inside my helmet. I coughed. My eyes stung and watered in the reek. I could barely see sieverts on the HUD, flashing instantly into the red. Bates drove us on without a word. My faceplate healed enough to shut off the alarm. My air began to clear. The scramblers had gained. By the time I could see clearly again, they were only a few meters behind us. Up ahead, Sasha came into view around the bend. Sasha, who had no backup, whose other cores had all been shut down on Sarasti's orders. Susan had protested at first. "If there's any opportunity to communicate—" "There won't be," he'd said. So there was Sasha, who was more resistant to Rorschach's influence, according to some criterion I never understood, curled up in a fetal ball with her gloves clamped against her helmet, and I could only hope to some dusty deity that she'd set the trap before this place had got to her. And here came the scramblers, and Bates was shouting, "Sasha, get out of the fucking way!" and braking hard. way too soon, the scrambling horde nipping at our heels like a riptide, and Bates yelled, "Sasha!" again, and finally Sasha moved, kicked herself into gear and off the nearest wall, and fled right back up the hole we'd blown in through. Bates yanked some joystick in her head, and our warrior sedan slewed and shat sparks and bullets and dove out after her. Sasha had set the trap just within the mouth of the breach. Bates armed it in passing with the slap of one-gloved hand. Motion sensors were supposed to do the rest, but the enemy was close behind, and there was no room to spare. It went off just as I was emerging into the vestibule. The cannon net shot out behind me in a glorious exploding conic, caught something, snapped back up the rabbit hole, and slammed into my grunt from behind. The recoil kicked us against the top of the vestibule so hard I thought the fabric would tear. It held, and it threw us back against the squirming things enmeshed in our midst. Writhing backbones everywhere, articulated arms lashing like bony whips. One of them entwined my leg and squeezed like a brick python. Bates's hands waved in a frantic dance before me, and that arm came apart into dismembered segments, bouncing around the enclosure. This was all wrong. They were supposed to be in the net. They were supposed to be contained. "Sasha, launch!" Bates barked. Another arm separated from its body and careened into the wall, coiling and uncoiling. The hole had flooded with aerosol foam core as soon as we'd pulled the net. A scrambler writhed, half embedded in that matrix, caught just a split second too late. Its central mass protruded like some great round tumor writhing with monstrous worms. "Sasha!" Artillery. The floor of the vestibule irised shut quick as a leg hold trap, and everything slammed against it. Grunts, people, scramblers whole and in pieces. I couldn't breathe. Every thimbleful of flesh weighed 100 kilograms. Something slapped us to one side, a giant hand batting an insect. Maybe a course correction, maybe a collision. But 10 seconds later, we were weightless again, and nothing had torn us open. We floated like mites in a ping-pong ball, surrounded by a confusion of machinery and twitching body parts. There was little of anything that might pass for blood. What there was floated in clear, shuddering spherules. The cannon net floated like a shrink-wrapped asteroid in our midst. The things inside had wrapped their arms around themselves, around each other, curled into a shivering and unresponsive ball. Compressed methonia hissed around them, keeping them fresh for the long trip home. "Holy shit," Sasha breathed, watching them. "The bloodsucker called it." He hadn't called everything. He hadn't called a mob of multi-armed aliens, ripping one of their own to pieces before my eyes. He hadn't seen that coming. Or at least, he hadn't mentioned it. I was already feeling nauseous. Bates was carefully bringing her wrists together. For a moment, I could barely make out a taut, dark thread of freak wire, fine as smoke, between them. Her caution was well advised. That stuff would slice through human limbs as easy as alien ones. One of the grunts groomed its mouthparts at her shoulder, cleaning gore from its mandibles. The freak wire vanished from my sight. Sight itself was dimming now. The inside of this great lead balloon was going dark around me. We were coasting, purely ballistic. We had to trust that Scylla would swoop in and snatch us once we'd achieved a discreet distance from the scene of the crime. We had to trust Sarasti. That was getting harder by the hour, but he'd been right so far. Mostly. "How do you know?" Bates had asked when he'd first laid out the plan. He hadn't answered. Chances are he couldn't have, not to us, any more than a baseline could have explained brain theory to the inhabitants of Flatland. But Bates hadn't been asking about tactics anyway, not really. Maybe she'd been asking for a reason, for something to justify this ongoing trespass into foreign soil, the capture and slaughter of its natives. On one level, she already knew the reason, of course. We all did. We could not afford to merely react. The risks were too great. We had to preempt. Cerasti, wise beyond all of us, saw this more clearly than we. Amanda Bates knew he was right in her mind, but perhaps she didn't feel it in her gut. Perhaps, I thought as my vision failed, she was asking Cerasti to convince her. But that wasn't all she was doing. Imagine you are Amanda Bates. The control you wield over your troops would give wet dreams and nightmares to generals of ages past. You can drop instantly into the sensorium of anyone under your command, experience the battlefield from any number of first person perspectives. Your every soldier is loyal unto death, asking no questions, obeying all commands with alacrity and dedication to which mere flesh could never even aspire. You don't just respect a chain of command, you are one. You are a little bit scared of your own power. You are a little bit scared of the things you've already done with it. Taking orders comes as naturally as giving them. Oh, you've been known to question policy on occasion, or seek a bigger picture than may be strictly necessary for the job at hand. Your command initiative has become the stuff of legends. But you have never disobeyed a direct order. When asked for your perspective, you serve it up straight and unvarnished, until the decision is made and the orders handed down. Then you do your job without question. Even when questions arise, you would hardly waste time asking them unless you expected an answer you could use. Why, then, demand analytical details from a vampire? Not for information. Might as well expect the sighted to explain vision to the congenitally blind. Not for clarification. There was no ambiguity in Cerasti's bottom line. Not even for the benefit of poor dumb Siri Keaton, who may have missed some salient point but is too ashamed to raise his own hand. No, there is only one reason why you might ask for such details. To challenge. To rebel, to the infinitesimal degree that rebellion is permitted once the word is given. You argued and advocated as forcefully as you could, back when Cerasti was soliciting input, but he ignored yours, abandoned any attempt at a communication, and preemptively invaded foreign territory. He knew that Rorschach might contain living beings, and still he tore it open without regard for their welfare. He may have killed helpless innocents. He may have roused an angry giant. You don't know. All you know is you've been helping him to do it. You've seen this kind of arrogance before, among your own kind. You had hoped that smarter creatures would be wiser ones. Bad enough to see such arrogant stupidity inflicted on the helpless, but to do it at these stakes beggars belief. Killing innocents is the least of the risks you're running. You're gambling with the fate of worlds, provoking conflict with a star-faring technology whose sole offense was to take your picture without permission. Your dissent has changed nothing. So you rein it in. All that slips out now is the occasional pointless question with no hope of an answer, its inherent insubordination so deeply buried you don't even see it yourself. If you did see it, you'd keep your mouth shut entirely, because the last thing you want is to remind Cerasti that you think he's wrong. You don't want him dwelling on that. You don't want him to think you're up to something. Because you are, even if you're not quite ready to admit it to yourself. Amanda Bates is beginning to contemplate a change of command. The laceration of my suit had done a real number on the gears. It took 3 solid days for Theseus to bring me back to life. But death was no excuse for falling behind the curve. I resurrected with a head full of updates clogging my inlays. I flipped through them, climbing down into the drum. The gang of 4 sat at the galley below me, staring at untouched portions of nutritionally balanced sludge on her plate. Cunningham, over in his inherited domain, grunted at my appearance and turned back to work, the fingers of one hand tapping compulsively on the desktop. Theseus's orbit had widened during my absence, and most of its eccentricities had been planed away. Now we kept our target in view from a more or less constant range of 3,000 kilometers. Our orbital period lagged Rorschach's by an hour. The alien crept implacably ahead of us along its lower trajectory, but a supplementary burn every couple of weeks would be enough to keep it in sight. We had specimens now, things to be examined under conditions of our own choosing. No point in risking any more close approaches until we'd wrung every useful datum from what we had. Cunningham had expanded his lab space during my time in the sepulchre. He'd built holding pens, one for each scrambler, modules partitioned by a common wall and installed in a whole new hab. The microwaved carcass had been sidelined like a discarded toy from a previous birthday, although according to the access logs, Cunningham still visited it every now and then. Not that he visited any part of the new wing in person, of course. Not that he wasn't even able to, not without suiting up and jumping across the hold. The whole compartment had been disconnected from its spinal lock and pushed to a tethered anchorage midway between spine and carapace. Serasti's orders, given to minimize risk of contamination. It was no skin off Cunningham's nose. He was happier leaving his body in pseudo-gravity anyway, while his consciousness flitted between the Waldos and sensors and bric-a-brac surrounding his new pets. Theseus saw me coming and pushed a squeeze bulb of sugary electrolytes from the galley dispenser. The gang didn't look up as I passed. One forefinger tapped absently against their temple, the lips pursed and twitched in the characteristic mode that said, "Internal dialogue in progress." I could never tell who was on top when they were like that. I sucked on the squeeze bulb and looked in on the pens. Two cubes suffused in pale red light. In one, a scrambler floated center stage, waving its segmented arms like seaweed in gentle surge. The occupant of the other cage was squeezed into a corner, four arms splayed across the converging walls, four others extended, waving again into open space. The bodies from which those arms sprouted were spheroids, not flattened discs as our first sample had been. They were only slightly compressed, and their arms sprouted not from a single equatorial band, but from across the whole surface. Fully extended, the floating scrambler was over 2 meters across. The other seemed roughly the same size. Neither moved, except for those drifting arms. Navy blue mosaics, almost black in the long wave, rippled across their surfaces like the patterns of wind on grass. Superimposed graphics plotted methane and hydrogen at reassuring Rorschach norms. Temperature and lighting ditto. An icon for ambient electromagnetics remained dark. I dipped into the archives, watched the arrival of the aliens from 2 days past, each tumbling unceremoniously into its pen, balled up, hugging themselves as they bounced gently around their enclosures. Fetal position, I thought, but after a few moments the arms uncoiled like the blooming of calcareous flowers. "Robert says Rorschach grows them," Susan James said behind me. I turned. Definitely James in there, but muted somehow. Her meal remained untouched. Her surfaces were dim, except for the eyes. Those were deep and a little hollow. "Grows?" I repeated. "In stacks. They have 2 navels each." She managed a weak smile, touched her belly with one hand and the small of her back with the other. "One in front, one behind. He thinks they grow in a kind of column piled up. When the top one develops to a certain point, it buds off from the stack and becomes free living." The archived scramblers were exploring their new environment now, climbing gingerly along the walls, unrolling their arms along the corners where the panels met. Those swollen central bodies struck me again. "So that first one with the flattened—" "Juvenile," she agreed. "Fresh off the stack. These ones are older. They plump out as they mature, Robert says," she added after a moment. I sucked the dregs from my squeeze bulb. "The ship grows its own crew." "If it's a ship," James shrugged. "If they're crew." I watched them move. There wasn't much to explore. The walls were almost bare, innocent of anything but a few sensor heads and gas nozzles. The pens had their own tentacles and manipulators for more invasive research needs, but those had been carefully sheathed during introduction. Still, the creatures covered the territory in careful increments, moving back and forth along parallel, invisible paths, almost as if they were running transects. James had noticed it too. Seems awfully systematic, doesn't it? What does Robert say about that? He says the behavior of honeybees and sphex wasps is just as complex, and it's all rote hardwiring, not intelligence. But bees still communicate, right? They do that dance to tell the hive where the flowers are. She shrugged, conceding the point. So you might be able to talk to these things. Maybe. You'd think. She massaged her brow between thumb and forefinger. We haven't got anywhere, though. We played some of their pigment patterns back to them, with variations. They don't seem to make sounds. Robert synthesized a bunch of noises that they might squeeze out of their cloacae if they were so inclined, but those didn't get us anywhere either. Harmonic farts, really. So we're sticking to the blood cells with Waldo's model. Pretty much. But they didn't go into a loop. Hardwired animals repeat themselves. Even smart ones pace or chew their fur. Stereotyped behaviors. But these two, they gave everything a very careful once-over and then just shut down. They were still at it in consensus, slithering across one wall, then another, a slow screw-thread track that would leave no square centimeter uncovered. Have they done anything since? I asked. She shrugged again. Nothing spectacular. They squirm when you poke them, wave their arms back and forth. They do that pretty much constantly, but there's no information in it that we can tell. They haven't gone invisible on us or anything. We blanked the adjoining wall for a while so they could see each other, even piped audio and air feeds. Robert thought there might be some kind of pheromonal communication, but nothing. They didn't even react to each other. Have you tried, well, motivating them? With what, Siri? They don't seem to care about their own company. We can't bribe them with food unless we know what they eat, which we don't. Robert says they're in no immediate danger of starvation anyway. Maybe when they get hungry, they can deal. I killed the archival feed and reverted to real time. Maybe they eat, I don't know, radiation or magnetic energy. The cage can generate magnetic fields, right? Tried it. She took a breath, then squared her shoulders. But I guess these things take time. He's only had a couple of days, and I only got out of the crypt myself a day ago. We'll keep trying. What about negative reinforcement? I wondered. She blinked. Hurt them, you mean? Not necessarily anything extreme, and if they're not sentient anyway. Just like that, Susan went away. Why, Keaton, you just made a suggestion. You giving up on this whole non-interference thing? Hello, Sasha. No, of course not. Just making a list of what's been tried. Good. There was an edge to her voice. Hate to think you were slipping. We're going to grab some downtime now, so maybe you could go and talk to Cunningham for a bit. Yeah, do that. And be sure to tell him your theory about radiation-eating aliens. I bet he could use a laugh. He stood at his post in biomed, though his empty chair was barely a meter away. The ubiquitous cigarette hung from between the fingers of one hand, burned down and burned out. His other hand played with itself, fingers tapping against thumb in sequence, little to index, index to little. Windows crawled with intelligence in front of him. He wasn't watching. I approached from behind. I watched his surfaces in motion. I heard the soft syllables rising from his throat. Yitbarah v'ish tabai v'yitpahar v'yitromam. Not his usual litany, not even his usual language. Hebrew, Consensus said. It sounded almost like a prayer. He must have heard me. His topology went flat and hard and almost impossible to decipher. It was increasingly difficult getting a fix on anyone these days, but even through those topological cataracts, Cunningham, as always, was a tougher read than most. Keaton, he said without turning. You're not Jewish, I said. It was. Spindle, I realized after a moment. Cunningham didn't do gender pronouns. But Isaac Spindle had been an atheist. All of us were. We'd all started out that way, at least. I didn't know you knew him, I said. It certainly wasn't policy. Cunningham sank into his chair without looking at me. In his head, and in mine, a new window opened within a frame marked Electrophoresis. I tried again. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude.
What can I do for you, Siri?
I was hoping you could bring me up to speed on your findings. A periodic chart of alien elements scrolled through the feed. Cunningham logged it and started another sample.
I've documented everything. It's all in consensus.
I made a play for ego. It would really help to know how you'd thumbnail it, though. What you think is important can be just as vital as the data themselves. He looked at me a moment. He muttered something, repetitive and irrelevant.
What's important is what's missing, he said after a moment. I've got good samples now, and I still can't find the genes. Protein synthesis is almost prionic. Reconformation instead of the usual transcription pathways. But I can't figure out how those bricks get slotted into the wall once they're made.
Any progress on the energy front? I asked.
Energy?
Aerobic metabolism on anaerobe budget, remember? You said they had too much ATP?
That I solved.
He puffed smoke. Far to stern, a fleck of alien tissue liquefied and banded into chemical strata.
They're sprinting.
Rotate that if you can. I couldn't. How do you mean? He sighed.
Biochemistry is a trade-off. The faster you synthesize ATP, the more expensive each molecule becomes. It turns out scramblers are a lot more energy efficient at making it than we are. They're just extremely slow at it, which might not be a big drawback for something that spends most of its time inactive. Rorschach, whatever Rorschach started out as, could have drifted for millennia before it washed up here. That's a lot of time to build up an energy reserve for bouts of high activity, and once you've laid the groundwork, glycolysis is explosive. 2,000-fold boost and no oxygen demand.
Scramblers sprint. Their whole lives.
They may come preloaded with ATP and burn it off throughout their lifespan.
How long would that be?
Good question, he admitted. Live fast, die young. If they ration it out, stay dormant most of the time, who knows?
Huh. The free-floating scrambler had drifted away from the center of its pen. One extended arm held a wall at bay. The others continued their hypnotic swaying. I remembered other arms, their motion not so gentle. Amanda and I chased one into a crowd. Cunningham was back at his samples.
I saw the record.
They tore it to pieces.
Uh-huh.
Any idea why? He shrugged.
Bates thought there might be some kind of civil war going on down there.
What do you think?
I don't know. Maybe it's right, or maybe scramblers are ritual cannibals, or they're aliens, Keaton. What do you want from me?
But they're not really aliens, at least not intelligent ones. War implies intelligence.
Ants wage war all the time. Proves nothing except that they're alive.
Are scramblers even alive? I asked.
What kind of question is that?
You think Rorschach grows them on some kind of assembly line. You can't find any genes. Maybe they're just biomechanical machines.
That's what life is, Keaton. That's what you are.
Another hit of nicotine, another storm of numbers, another sample.
Life isn't either or, it's a matter of degree.
What I'm asking is, are they natural? Could they be constructs?
Is a termite mound a construct? Beaver dam? Spaceship? Of course. Were they built by naturally evolved organisms acting naturally? They were. So tell me how anything in the whole deep multiverse can ever be anything but natural.
I tried to keep the irritation out of my voice. You know what I mean.
It's a meaningless question. Get your head out of the 20th century.
I gave up. After a few seconds, Cunningham seemed to notice the silence. He withdrew his consciousness from the machinery and looked around with fleshly eyes, as if searching for some mosquito that had mysteriously stopped whining. What's your problem with me? I asked. Stupid question. Obvious question. Unworthy of any synthesis to be so direct. His eyes glittered in that dead face.
Processing without comprehension. That's what you do, isn't it?
That's a colossal oversimplification.
Hmm.
Cunningham nodded. Then why can't you seem to comprehend how pointless it is to keep peeking over our shoulders and writing home to our masters?
Someone has to keep Earth in the loop.
7 months each way. Long loop.
Still,
We're on our own out here, Keaton. You're on your own. The game's going to be long over before our masters even know it's started.
he sucked smoke.
Or perhaps not. Perhaps you're talking to someone closer, hmm? That it? Is the fourth wave telling you what to do?
There is no fourth wave. Not that anyone's told me, anyway.
Probably not. They'd never risk their lives out here, would they? Too dangerous even to hang back and watch from a distance. That's why they built us.
We're all self-made. Nobody forced you to get the rewire.
No, nobody forced me to get the rewire. I could have just let them cut out my brain and pack it into heaven, couldn't I? That's the choice we have. We can be utterly useless, or we can try and compete against the vampires and the constructs and the AIs. And perhaps you could tell me how to do that without turning into an utter freak.
So much in the voice. Nothing at all on the face. I said nothing.
See what I mean? No comprehension.
He managed a tight smile.
So I'll answer your questions. I'll delay my own work and hold your hand because Cerastes told us to. I guess that superior vampire mind sees some legitimate reason to indulge your constant ankle nipping, and it's in charge, so I'll play along. But I'm not nearly that smart, so you'll forgive me if it all seems a bit naff.
I'm just...
You're just doing your job. I know, but I don't like being played, Keaton. And that's what your job is.
Even back on Earth, Robert Cunningham had barely disguised his opinion of the ship's commissar. It had been obvious even to the topologically blind. I'd always had a hard time imagining the man. It wasn't just his expressionless face. Sometimes, not even the subtler things behind would show up in his topology. Perhaps he repressed them deliberately, resenting the presence of this mole among the crew. It would hardly have been the first time I'd encountered such a reaction. Everyone resented me to some extent. Oh, they liked me well enough, or thought they did. They tolerated my intrusions and cooperated and gave away far more than they thought they did. But beneath Spindle's gruff camaraderie, beneath James's patient explanations, there was no real respect. How could there be? These people were the bleeding edge, the incandescent apex of hominid achievement. They were trusted with the fate of the world. I was just a tattletale for small minds back home. Not even that much when home receded too deeply into the distance. Superfluous mass. Couldn't be helped. No use getting bothered over it. Still, Spindle had only coined commissar half-jokingly. Cunningham believed it and didn't laugh. And while I'd encountered many others like him over the years, those had only tried to hide themselves from sight. Cunningham was the first who seemed to succeed. I tried to build the relationship all the way through training, tried to find the missing pieces. I watched him working the simulator's teleops one day, exercising the shiny new interfaces that spread him through walls and wires. He was practicing his surgical skills on some hypothetical alien the computer had conjured up to test his technique. Sensors and jointed teleops sprouted like the legs of an enormous spider crab from an overhead mount. Spirit possessed, they dipped and weaved around some semi-plausible holographic creature. Cunningham's own body merely trembled slightly, a cigarette jiggling at the corner of its mouth. I waited for him to take a break. Eventually, the tension ebbed from his shoulders. His vicarious limbs relaxed. So, I tapped my temple. Why'd you do it? He didn't turn. Above the dissection, sensors swiveled and stared back like dismembered eye stalks. That was the center of Cunningham's awareness right now, not this nicotine-stained body in front of me. Those were his eyes, or his tongue, or whatever unimaginable bastard senses he used to parse what the machines sent him. Those clusters aimed back at me, at us, and if Robert Cunningham still possessed anything that might be called vision, he was watching himself from eyes 2 meters outside his own skull.
Do what, exactly? He said at last. The enhancements?
Enhancements.
as though he'd upgraded his wardrobe instead of ripping out his senses and grafting new ones into the wounds. I nodded. "It's vital to keep current," he said. "If you don't reconfigure, you can't retrain. If you don't retrain, you're obsolete inside a month, and then you're not much good for anything except heaven or dictation." I ignored the jibe. "Pretty radical transformation, though." "Not these days." "Didn't it change you?" His body dragged on the cigarette. Targeted ventilation sucked away the smoke before it reached me. "That's the whole point." "Surely you were affected personally, though. Surely—" "Ah." He nodded. At the far end of shared motor nerves, teleops jiggled in sympathy. "Change the eyes that look at the world? Change the me that does the looking?" Something like that. Now he was watching me with fleshly eyes. Across the membrane, those snakes and eye stalks returned to their work on the virtual carcass, as if deciding they'd wasted enough time on pointless distractions. I wondered which body he was in now. "I'm surprised you'd have to ask," the meat one said. "Doesn't my body language tell you everything? Aren't Jargonauts supposed to read minds?" He was right, of course. I wasn't interested in Cunningham's words. Those were just the carrier wave. He couldn't hear the real conversation we were having. All his angles and surfaces spoke volumes, and although their voices were strangely fuzzed with feedback and distortion, I knew I'd be able to understand them eventually. I only had to keep him talking. But Yuka Sarasti chose that moment to wander past and surgically trash my best laid plans. "Sir is best in his field," he remarked, "but not when it gets too close to home." And I am going to have to call it at that for today. This week, rather. Next week, we will get through the next sizable chunk. And yeah, 2 more sessions basically, and we'll be done with this with Peter Watts's Blindsight. Um, Hope people are enjoying it so far. If they're not, I'm sorry. If I'm making a hash of it all, please, and you have suggestions, please suggest. I love comments. Comments are good. Criticism is good. More constructive, the better, of course. But I'll take anything. So yeah, thanks for tuning in. I will, of course, be doing it next week and the week after, barring, I don't know, some major incidents, something unforeseen. As ever, I do have Mecha Mondays and Warframe Wednesdays as well. With Mecha Mondays, I'll be continuing our jaunt through one man's journey to get his own justice, Metal Wolf Chaos. And then Warframe Wednesdays, we'll be doing whatever Warframe has served up latest. All right. Thanks for tuning in and have a great day. Bye.